Good morning, everyone. I'm meteorologist Ted Keller. I have your severe weather outlooks for today, and it looks like things are ticking up a little bit for today, Friday, over the weekend, even into Monday. And then, generally speaking, later into June, it looks like things are going to be on the uptick. We're breaking down a pattern that had really prevented a lot of widespread severe weather, and that seems to be changing beginning with today. So we have this level 1 out of 5, which is the marginal risk that covers much of the high plains down to Texas, small little chunk of Montana too, adjacent areas of that area as well. If we zoom in, though, on the slight risk, the yellow, that is basically in that corridor right there in the panhandle of Texas, from Amarillo to Lubbock to the Midland Odessa area. That pretty much describes it. But you do notice the marginal area does extend way up into parts of Oklahoma today. The tornado risk is outlined right in the core of that yellow, but not encompassing all of that slight risk area. So a little bit more of a narrow area of 2% risk from Amarillo down to Midland, again in that general area. If you look at NATOcast, they put a little bullseye up here in Colorado, northeast of Denver, and don't say much about the high plains risk. We'll see how that unfolds today. I have a feeling that it's a broad flow, so I could make an argument for a tornado anywhere along this area here today, even a little bit here. Not a great risk, but I think that's why you're seeing a divergence. So the upper level flow is not fantastic. In other words, the wind field is not good, but the instability is pretty good, and they're not always matching up today. So I think it's an interesting forecast. Anyway, severe hail risk today in that same area once again. And they do put the lowest of the intensity levels up there, so a high probability of it being 1 to 2 inch hail where you see that striped area. And the wind risk is equally the same, 15%, in about that same area, but that encompasses more of the slight risk. So the implication is there that the wind is a factor in determining where that slight risk will be, and they have the lowest intensity level on that wind field in the yellow area and in areas outside. Again, the meaning of that is highest probability of wind is where it's yellow, but even though it's a lower probability where it's brown, the same wind intensity might be expected. If we take a look at CSU's model here, they don't mention tornadoes at all today. And again, it would take just a subtle amount of things going on a very small scale to get one to form today, but not impossible. Hail and wind mentioned much more north than south in Texas. Again, that's what I'm kind of saying. I think that there's room up in this area here for more severe weather. I'm going to show you why. Here's the 500 millibar flow forecast for later today. So it's subtle. We have a pretty sharp little shortwave right here. And then the colors are wind. So when you see a bend in the flow like this, and you see a maximum area here where the winds are stronger, that's a short wave, pretty much. And short just means small, maybe a couple of states large, like you see here, Four Corners area. And then there's also this other little wind field coming out across North Texas. So generally speaking, this is favorable for supporting supercells on the edge, but there. Up in here, not so much, but we do have that approaching wave, so the tornado risk is not quite matched with this, not quite, but this map I think I picked, this is 5 o'clock. So there would be room into the evening for something to develop in this area, or even out in this area in general, I think. That's why I think that maybe subsequent forecasts, once we look at this, the movement of these short waves might enhance this area a little bit more than is indicated presently. And the instability this is a very typical pattern for this type of tilted short wave, where it's kind of bending back and like this. And in these threat areas out here, the winds are going to be out of the east. Both on today's forecast and tomorrow's, I'll show you here in a minute. So the instability this time of year generally has no problem stepping up to the task. So we're looking at plenty of unstable areas indicated by CAPE, which is a very traditional way of looking at severe, convective potential. And the name is convective available potential energy. Anyway, a severe thunderstorm risk tomorrow, now Saturday. This has been the case for days now, from western and central Nebraska northward into parts of South Dakota. That's the level 2 area. Pretty broad area of level 1 here. I think there's room for tweaking in some of these areas, especially here. Maybe not so much down here, but we'll just have to keep an eye on that. But as it stands, this is the level 2 out of 5 risk area that includes North Platte, Rapid City, Valentine, Nebraska would be included in that. Not a lot of large populated areas out here, to be honest, but nevertheless, that's where the severe weather risk is. Kind of a broad brush 2% tornado risk that matches that area exactly. On Saturday, if we look at the storm net map for tornado maximum, this is between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. Saturday evening. It puts the highest risk shifted a little more to the east, Grand Island, Kearney, and Lincoln in that area. So that's something to keep in mind as well. That would be more of an overnight in evening into the overnight hours kind of risk because it's a 7 hour broad brush kind of forecast. On Saturday, again, we go to CSU. They keep the tornado risk in a large area that copies what the SPC said and expands on it a little bit. Expands on it northwest, expands on it southeast. I think that the threat may actually go more down into this area of south central Kansas than indicated here. Hail risk, the highest, it's a 15%, not mentioning much about wind risk with this particular setup. If we look at the 500 millibar flow on Saturday, this thing weakens a little bit, but there are little wind maximum areas here and here and here. And I think any of these that step up and one thunderstorm that forms in a favorable area would be able to become a supercell, which requires the bulk shear. Requires, this is just the 500 millibar flow, not the bulk shear, but it kind of implies it. And in those areas, that's what you would need to really hold the structure of a thunderstorm together long enough for there to develop large hail, to develop circulations at the surface that would encourage a tornado. So again, Saturday's forecast is very interesting to look at. This area here is certainly something I would watch carefully, but I wouldn't necessarily sit down and take a break on this area here. And I think over this part of Kansas, I was looking at that earlier. It looks like the overall wind flow will just be too weak on Saturday. It's getting better just to the west, but not quite. So I say this because if I do a storm chase on Saturday, I think I'm going to have to go more west and northwest than I originally thought I might have to, but that's okay. And the instability looks almost exactly the same. In fact, it even gets worse with this model indicating 4,000 plus Cape values through parts of Kansas and Nebraska. So the unstable air is there. And then on Sunday, again, there's room to, I think, put a slight risk in here, maybe around here. I live in the Ozarks. We're on the edge of that. I'm keeping an eye on that. And I'll mention the Ozarks briefly here in a minute, too, for Monday. But again, I think that the nature of that flow is that there might be a bright spot anywhere along this area that might flourish severe weather activity, depending on the subtleties of where that wind field and where the disturbances show up in it. On Sunday, again, tornado risk not even really mentioned, the hail and wind risk below the 15% threshold. By the way, I say that because the SPC would consider issuing an outlook if it were demonstrated that that threshold could be met. They watch it, and they don't use this exclusively, of course, but just to mention it. So tornado risk for Sunday is up from Kansas City northward to Omaha. Again, these are pretty low probabilities, and this is for 1 p.m. to 1 a.m. on Sunday, so more of a daytime evening event is what is being suggested there. And then if I look at this, shift this over to northwest Missouri this is 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., so the next 12 hours on Sunday. So again, something to watch in this area on Sunday for maybe a tornado. Then I want to mention this on Monday, even though, again, the SPC has not put anything out. It would show up here if they did. But it's kind of interesting to note that we're in a 15% area here on Monday. It probably would be mostly hail and maybe some gusty winds. Tornado threat, again, would be highly conditional on whether we can get supercells to last long enough and enough low-level flow to match up to get that low-level rotation that we would require, including interactions with other storms. That's often a thing. And then here, the supercell composite for the next 7 days. Looks heavy, as we just showed you. Pretty much this ends up being a summary of what I just said. Remember, this is accumulated percentages over a 7-day period that ends on the 4th. Then we go to the 5th through the 11th. Things lighting up a little bit more consistently in the high plains, which you would expect from a climatological standpoint for June. But also this area here can be very, very, especially in early June. And then again, it kind of shifts westward later in the month, but still the percentages are pretty high.